of that input to perform actions. We were leaving spaces between them, but now we're going to have sub-functions. The two different types of function that we'll be talking about is the void function. So the void it doesn't have a return value, and then the second part of today's lecture, we talk about function that returns a value. So example of a function that we've been using in this course so far is the print function, the input function, and the math square root function. So what's a void function? Void function are a function that doesn't return a value. As we've learned in terms of naming, we use the camel case, just like variables. The names should be descriptive and easy for us to understand and describe the task that we're performing. So usually we use verbs like display ticket or calculate income tax and things like that. The function always followed by a bracket after their name, and calling a function is executing the function. So when we call the function is when we actually execute this function, and we also, there's a part where we define the function. So we define what the function behavior, what does it do when we're calling that function. And when a void function is called, it's only then the only thing on that line. So a void function, when it comes back from that call, it jumps to the next line. So that's why it's when you have a void function, you only have it in that line, nothing afterwards. So an example of calling a void function is, for example, print hello world. So the function, so this is where we're calling the function. And that function called print, and the variable that we're sending in that function is the hello world. So that's what we wanted to be executed as part of that print function. So in this second example, show the print function being executing, function called shown as a box. So for predefined function in Python, such as print, so print is a predefined function it's stored in Python libraries. Code exists that specifies how the function works. However, we can't see that code inside the function. So, because this is a predefined function, we can actually see what's happening in it. But we will be creating void function later on today, and we will be able to see what they do. So when a void function is called, execution jump to the start of the code of that function. So if you imagine the code goes line by line, and then we call the function, then the execution of the lines would jump from where we are to the function, wherever it is in the program, and then it will perform the steps of that function, and then we'll come back and then drop to the next line of the code. So, for example, the following show how print function is called. So we print hello world. So we're calling the print function. We're passing the variable hello world, and then so 1.1 is predefined code to display a message, which is hello world, and then it returns to line number 1 once it's completed. This will be a better example to explain that, because this is a function that we're creating. So a program can write their own function. So programmers can write their own function. So program description, display a picture of a rocket composed of triangles and rectangles. So in the old way, or up to this point, before we start talking about function, you will be printing every line by line in your program to get this. So we want to outline the program. So the rockets consist of triangle, two equal sizes, rectangles, and a triangle that is the same as the first one. So these, and then this, and these two triangle in the middle. Rectangle, sorry. So the CD code: display triangle, and then display rectangle, then display rectangle, then display triangle. So this is what we're doing here. Is there's the program called display rockets, and then first time we're calling a function called triangle. Once it comes back, we're calling a function called display rectangle, and once it comes back, we ask it to display another rectangle, and then once that come back, we display triangle. Then here, and that's in the CEDAR code, here's our definition of that function. So in the first part, we're calling the function, and in here, we're defining that function. So what does display triangle do? It display first line is a star, then display 2 stars on the second line, then display 5 stars on the third line, and then it exits. And what display rectangle does, it have the 5 stars, 2 stars, 2 stars with the space in the middle, and then 5 stars, and then it exits. So basically, the program when it runs, it goes the first one here. So jump from here at the top to this function, perform the task of that, then exit, and goes to here, and then it jumps from that to the defined function, perform this task, and exit, and comes back, and so on and so forth. So that try to illustrate that. So display rocket. So we go to triangle, we exit, we then go to rectangle, then we exit, then we go to another rectangle, then we exit, and then we display the triangle again, and then we stop. Does that make sense? Is people understanding that so far? Anyone have any question? Let me know if I'm going too fast with this. So disk checking, how do we perform disk checking to that? So let's have a look here. So the first line is it's the obviously the start of the program. Then 2 is display triangle. So I want you to see what happened here. So we jump from 2 to the defining of that function, which is display triangle, which is 7, 8, and then 9 display another line, and then 10 display another line, and then 11 is the exit, and then goes to the back to the function that we called. So we go back to 2, then it goes to 3, which then goes to 12 and 13, because 12 is just the name of that function, and 13 is actually when we're doing something, and that when we print the 5 stars. And then we do 14, 15, 16, which they all print, display the stars. Then we get to the exit, which then take us back to 3, which then jump to 4, and 4 goes back to 12, and so on and so forth. So do we understand how that works? Yep. So in Python, function must be defined before we can use it can be used. A function definition specifies the code for function and start with a keyword of def. So that's to indicate that we are defining that function. A function is executed when it's called, so it's not when it's defined. So just like in the CEDAR code, we're calling the function here, but we're defining them in the second part. a function is executed when it's called, not when it's defined. And in the following example, the last line of the program, main, call the main function, which in turns call the display triangle and display rectangle functions. So when you look at the Python program, so we're starting by defining the main program, which does the which then it goes and call these four functions. Then we define this function, which is the display triangle and display rectangle. But when we actually execute that program, it's actually when we're calling the main function. So all these lines does nothing until we get to here. So when we're calling main, it's actually what it's doing is calling that function that we've defined at the start, which in turns goes and call this function, which we have defined. So is that clear? We understand what's happening here? Yep. All right. So what's the void function syntax? So in the C code, calling a function is executing the function, do the instruction, which will do the instruction that is specified in the declaration, and defining a function is starting what we would do when it's called. So this is a set of instructions. So calling a void function could look like that: function name, a bracket, or a function name, and we're sending parameters. Example of that is a predefined print, when we say print and then we put the parameters in there for that function to go and then print them. And how we define a void function, so we put the function name and then the statement, and then we have the exit to indicate that this is the definition of the function. Again, we could have the function name and parameters and their types as an input, and then we have statements and exit. In Python, the syntax is calling a function is basically just a function name and a bracket, or the function name and parameters passed in it. And the way that we indicate we are defining a function is by putting the word the word def, D-E-F, and the function name. And again, it could be with no parameters or with parameters. So I want you to spend some time thinking about that. So write a Python code to define a void function named input car speed that is to promote a user for speed of the prompt the user for a speed of the car in kilometers per hour, and store the value in a variable named car speed. No validation is required for this example. So spend a few minutes trying to come up with the definition of that in Python. Once you've done that, once you define the input car speed function, which its sole purpose is to basically input the car speed, write the Python code to call that function. So that should be easy. If that function, if we define this function, if we want to call it, how do we call it? That should be very simple. And then last part is write a function calling input valid car speed that allows the user to input the car speed, validating the car speed, ensuring that it's between 0 and 300. So we're doing the same. So the first part is we creating a function that inputs a value. Then we're calling that function, and then the third one, we're introducing validation. So I'm just gonna share with you how it looks like. So to define a function, we basically have the word def input car speed. So we ask you to write a Python code to define a void function named input. So that's what this does. And that it's to prompt the user for a speed of a car in kilometers per hour and store that variable in the car speed. So basically all this is asking us to do is to create a function called input car speed, which have a variable called car speed to prompt the user to input the car speed. That's as simple as that. Then it says write a Python code to call the above function. So once we have defined the function, to call a function is in Python, we just put the function name and bracket. Unless, as we said, the bracket could be empty, or we could put some parameters in them. And the last part is write a function calling its input valid car speed. So now we have a new function called input valid car speed that allow your user to input car speed. So just like the first one, but this time with validation, and ensure that it's between 0 and 300 kilometers exclusive. So in this example, we're defining a function called input valid car speed, and the actions or statements happen inside that is we allow the user to input the car speed, but then we validate it to make sure that it needs to be between 0 and 300. So in the while statement, as long as it's outside of that, we print an error, and then we prompt the user to re-input the car speed and specifying that it needs to be between 0 and 300. Anyone have a question on that? All right. The next part we talk about is the local and global variables. So what's the difference between the two? So basically a local variable is a variable that we're using within the function. And once we exit that function, that value will no longer be usable. So it will just basically be wiped off. Whereas a global variable, it's a variable that is used potentially throughout the program. So it maintains its value until we change it. So so when we're initializing these variables for the global one, we always do them near to the top of the program before we defining any function, and they are declared global inside the function. So when we have a global variable that we defined at the start of the program, when we use them in the function, we need to declare they are a global. And we will see examples of that in some of the Python examples later on. So this is an example that we done before, a membership problem revisited. So this is for club membership fees program. And we're going to do the validation. So defining diagram, so the input for this program is the membership type, and then the processing that we do in it is we input input and validate the member type, determine the membership fee, display the membership fee, then total the membership fee, and then display the total. In terms of output, we have the membership fee and the total fee. So when we want to outline the solution for this, we're looking at a while loop is required for the main loop with a sentinel value of x, which will be the value that we use to exit that loop. And a while loop is required to validate the membership type. Then we have in there a nested if. It's also required to determine the membership type from the membership type small. So the serial code for this is so the program will be called calculate membership, and we're declaring a variable here, total fee equals 0. Input, we're inputting the membership type. We're doing the validation of that input to make sure it's correct. Then the next loop is where we determine whether we're exiting or we are working out the membership fee types. What I want you to see here from this serial code is when we have the input again, we're doing the validation again. So this is how we solve it normally. Now let's look at this now with function. So this is without function, and now let's have a look at when we're using function. So we're still declaring total fees equals 0 as a global variable. Then we input the validation membership type. So that's the first function. This function will ensure that the membership type we entered is valid. And see how it's represented as one line compared to when we look at it here. It's quite more. This is the part that do the validation. So it's much cleaner here when we look at that, and the description of the name of the function, it allows to understand what it's doing. So it's input valid membership type. So this is obviously a validation function. This is still the same while membership is not equal x. So while we're not wanting to exit, then what we want to do, we represent that by another function called member call membership fee, calculate membership fee, and then we're performing the normal statements. Then we, in the case of the old way, we inputting the program and then we're doing the validation in these lines, whereas in here we're just presenting it by the call of that function called input valid membership type. So it's much cleaner to see this and understand it. But what I want you to be aware of is that this is the main part of the program. We still need to identify the or put the serial code for the function that we are calling. So the first function, which is input valid membership type, and we defining what that function does. It's a prompt the user to input the membership type, and then we do a validation on it to make sure it's within the acceptable values. If not, then we loop again until we get the right value. And the second function that we call is calculate membership type. Again, it's using the if statement to determine what type of membership to then work out the membership fee. So are we all still following this? It's easy to understand. Any question? No? So the program main main line is now simplified. So what we can see from the main program is a lot simpler to follow and understand, because it's showing the main things the program actually doing through the calling of the function, and because the function names are easy to understand, and describing the actions of this function is made it really easy to understand. All right. So when we want to do disk checking for how that runs, so it's the membership type equals Z, and then J, and the correct result is membership equal fees equal 80, and then we're inputting the type X, which is correctly exit. So it's hard to not having the two screen next to each other, but I want you to imagine this is what we this is what the main program we're running. So we what was the first value is Z. So we the first thing is we calling input membership type. So we jumped to from so line 1, line 2, line 3, then we jump to line 12, and that's when we ask or prompt the user to input the type. Type will be equal to Z. So when we check to see if it's any of this value, it's not going to be any of this value. Therefore, we will display an error message and prompt the user to input the membership type again. So we jump back to 12 when so they were inputted, but will still be in while. So we go back to 14. We check. And they put J, it's one of these values, and that's when we exit that loop. And we come back to here, and that's when we check if that membership type is not equal to X, and then we jump to calculate. It's really hard not to be able to show you here. Let's have a look at it here. So we got to 16 when we input the valid membership. We exit from there, and then we we're still checking that it's whether it's one of these values. So this is a negative while. We want to make sure that if any of this is false, we exit. So then we check in that it's not equal to X. That's true. Therefore, we can go and now check for the type. So it's not F. It is J. It's true. And for J, it's an $80. Then we add that to the total. We display the $80, and then we come back again to validate the input, and in this case it was X. X will take us out of that loop to validate because it's one of it makes that statement false, but X, it does equal X, so makes that loop false, and that's when we exit. And because we only had one membership, the total fee will equal 80. I advise you to have a look at this by yourself and maybe have two pieces of papers or open it on two screens to see to follow the code. So the code for this program, so we have two global variable, which is the membership type, and we initialize it to space, and the membership phase, which we initialize it to 0. So these are variables that we're planning to be using in the program in different places. So that's why whenever we use them inside a function, we declare them as a global variables. We don't need to do that for local ones. Local ones is the ones that used only in that function and not outside of that function. So the main function, which basically is we're declaring the total fee to we're defining a local variable, total fees equals 0. We want to input the valid membership type. This is a function that we're calling in here. And while the user hasn't finished, so what we're doing here is while not equal to X, we're calling calculating the fees. And then we're doing this calculation of the summing up. And then we're calling the input membership type again. So that's for the main part of the code. To define the function that we've created, first one is the input validation type. Again, because we're using this membership type, which is a variable that we declared at the start of the program, it's in the global one, and we're using it inside this function, we identify it as a global variable. And we're doing the validation here. The next function is the calculate membership. Again, we're using two fields here, which we declared at the start, and they're global. That's why we need to identify them as a global. And we're doing the calculation for the membership type. Then at the end, we're calling the program. So the reason we're calling the program at the end is because these need to be defined before we can execute the program. Any question at this stage? This function is really a type of programs you need to start using them to have a better understanding of how they work. Once you understand the concept of when you're calling the function, and then when you define the function, and also understanding global and local variables, you will have a better understanding of it. But the only way you can do it is by practice. All right, that's the part A of the lectures. Let's have a break, just 10 minutes break, and then we'll come back and talk about the function that return a value.